trauma, like so.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know how many people we're expecting, but I'm happy to start whenever we're ready.
Yeah, let's just give another minute or two. Sometimes it just takes a bit for people to pop on.
Okay, sounds good. Well, in that case, I want to know what's been your favorite part of America to our guests from Mongolia.
In Utah, Salt Lake.
Utah?
Snow?
Oh, mountain. It's very beautiful.
Just we are in Utah 2 days, and therefore couldn't see any other places.
Yeah, they've only been here 2 days, so still a lot more to see, hopefully.
Yeah. Cool.
They get a nice winter storm to see.
Right.
Yeah.
But I suppose it's probably quite cold and wintry in Mongolia as well.
Yeah, it has a lot of snows, but the weather is not so cold like in UB in Mongolia.
Not so cold.
Not so
Yeah.
cold, yeah. 0 degrees.
Yeah, it's warm for them here.
What? It's warm right now in Utah? That's crazy.
Yeah, Mongolia. Yeah, it's the coldest capital on earth. So it's -20 to -40 in the winter.
In the winter night, -30 to 35, and the daytime is -15 to 25.
Yeah,
it's quite cold.
That is so cold.
Yeah.
Well, it's
That's
great
crazy.
to provide some warm weather for you in the middle of our snowstorm.
Not so cold.
right.
So it's usually it goes the other way around, and people who come to visit don't have the winter clothing and they're very, very cold. We had a guest from Latin America a few weeks ago, and he was very worried about having all the jackets and hats and everything. And we had to borrow things. But it seems like you are you're more prepared. For it. Okay, well, I think we've given people enough time to hop on if they're going to. There may still be some folks trickling in. A lot of our team is in Cambodia at the moment, so we'll just talk and kind of go from there. So why don't you go ahead, Grace?
Okay, sounds good. Yeah. Thanks for being here this afternoon. I'm excited to just give a little update on our project. It's the Nyano Nani Thermoregulatory Device, which is essentially an infant warmer used to address neonatal hypothermia in Nepal, or just generally provide more improved thermal care for infants in Nepal. My name is Grace Richards. I am a pre-medical undergraduate student at the University of Utah and a scholar at the Center for Global Surgery. I did my undergraduate degree in biomedical engineering, so I do have a little bit of interest in the medical device process, which is related to this research as well. The principal investigator of this project is Dr. Tomlin, and it is Dr. Tomlin and Dr. Ali Judkin's brainchild, and I'm just the research assistant along for the ride. So happy to give a little information, a little update about our project. So currently, what we want to, like I mentioned, this device does address neonatal mortality in Nepal. And so I just want to go into a little bit the current state of that measure in Nepal. And we know that right now, the incidence of neonatal mortality is 17 out of 1,000 births. And we have, quite actually a good idea of that in the research. And our sustainable development goal globally is to have no more than 12 out of 1,000 births, have a neonatal mortality rate of no more than 12 out of 1,000 births in any country by 2030. So while neonatal mortality in Nepal has improved substantially over the last century, we do still have a long ways to go. And at the current trajectory, it will be a long stretch to meet that metric by 2030. So hypothermia, while it is not the cause listed, so to speak, for a neonatal death in Nepal, it is a major underlying cause of many of the pathologies that lead to neonatal mortality in Nepal. And the 4 of the major the most common causes of neonatal mortality for newborns is listed here on the right. And for all of these, there has been research and different studies looking into hypothermia being the underlying cause of many of these pathologies, or all 4 of these pathologies. And we know that hypothermia could likely be related to these deaths that newborns are dying of in Nepal, because hypothermia has a high incidence rate in Nepal and has been reported to be as high as 94%. Thermal care for newborns in Nepal is a little bit understudied. So it's been hard to kind of get a good grasp of where we're at with that. But we do know that the World Health Organization has given recommendations recently for thermal care in Nepal. We have 14 of those listed here on the left. And we do also know that in implementations, or I guess I should say interventions that incorporate these recommendations, they have been effective in many different locations throughout Nepal, many different circumstances. But adoption of these recommendations is low. One study says that less than 10% of neonates in Nepal receive optimal thermal care. One reason for this could be because there is no national guideline for implementation of these recommendations. So we wanted to look a little bit more into what newborn specialist physicians in Nepal, what they would prioritize in their thermal care as they are kind of looking to make sure that a newborn baby receives optimal thermal care. What are they thinking about? What is the most important things to them? So Dr. Tomlin and Dr. Judkins, and as well as I, did a study through using the Delphi method to figure out what 6 Nepali newborn specialist physicians would prioritize out of those World Health Organization recommendations. And we have this table here on the right, which shows that in different settings. As you could, I'm sure, assume or maybe even have a knowledge of, that many births in Nepal are not in the hospital setting. Many of them are in a home setting or in a community setting, right? So that's going to vary what those physicians would prioritize in those different situations. But in a hospital setting, we can see that a resuscitation table with a radiant heat source is really important. That's something that those physicians do really value. We also can see that from these results, physicians are often valuing, these 6 physicians that we spoke to and that we did the study with are often valuing interventions that are looking at those first few moments after birth, up to maybe even an hour after birth. But it's important as well to make sure that we're providing optimal thermal care throughout those first 28 days, as there's a lot of research that long-term thermal care is really important in preventing the pathologies that are leading to neonatal mortality in Nepal. So here, I want to introduce the Nyano Nani device. This is a device that was made by the National Innovation Center, which is a center in Nepal. This is actually the first medical device that will be seeking regulatory approval from a Nepali engineer, from a Nepali firm. So it's really exciting, and it's already been successful. It's on a kind of an experimental usage in Nepal, and the demand for it from hospitals and different clinics and centers in Nepal is really high. And so that's keeping the National Innovation Center busy, but they're also seeking to get regulatory approval, which I'll talk about in just a second. But we know that this demand is probably so high because in Nepal, they don't have adequate access to these kind of warmers that we might use in a developed country. This is protocol, this is standard procedure in a developed country, but they don't have adequate access to a device like this. And where there is access to devices like this, should it malfunction, should it break down, there's not necessarily a standard procedure for making sure that it can be fixed. There's not a way to ensure that the parts are able to get replaced because it's being outsourced from far away. So this device does solve a lot of these problems by being effective, low cost, locally produced. It's made by this center that's in Nepal itself, And so they also, in designing this infant warmer, were able to keep the needs of their own community in mind. So as I spoke about, this project is really cool because not only will it be the approval of this device specifically, but it will also be the regulatory approval of the first medical device to get the approval of the Nepali government, which can provide a pathway for future medical devices to come from Nepal and from different firms, even in other low and middle income countries as well. And so we know essentially what happened is when they were looking to get regulatory approval, they went to the Nepali government and said, how do we do this? And the Nepali government said, we don't know. We've never given regulatory approval to a medical device. And so they said, okay, well, are you going to make these standards? And this was all with Dr. Tomlin and Dr. Judkins. This was kind of a little bit before I got on board, but just in a recent timeline. And then the government kind of said, well, maybe we'll make our own standards, but it might take several years. We don't even know if that's something that we would prioritize. Why don't you just look at the standards that they have in the US? Why don't you just look at the standards for medical devices from the FDA or international standards that they have for medical devices? So that's what we're going off of. That's what we're kind of aiming to fulfill, is the standards that we have here in the US from the FDA. And that's why myself and our team is able to be helpful, because we do understand that process and have been involved in regulatory medical device process in the US. And so we know, kind of here on the left, we have essentially a diagram of really the core parts of the design regulatory process. And the key to all of this is that through each step, it needs to be meticulously documented. So that's kind of what the FDA is looking for, is that when you have a medical device, you're looking for approval, you're going to turn in all the documentation that you've done once you've completed each one of these steps. And even throughout iterations of these steps, you know, kind of in a timeline, you're going to turn those into the FDA and make sure that your risk analysis is integrated. So just briefly, first, you're going to look at the user needs. So in our case, right, we would need a device that can heat a baby. That's our user need, right? We need the baby to be warm, make sure that they don't have neonatal hypothermia. And so then we need to define our parameters. That would be our design input. For example, the average newborn needs to be able to be heated 10 degrees, right? So we're putting a parameter around it. And then our design process was like, what kind of heating module do we need that could heat 10 degrees, right? And then design output is putting that all together into an actual device. And once we get to the output, we want to go back and check and make sure, okay, is this heating module we put in, can it actually heat a baby of, an average newborn size, 10 degrees? And then if it can, we go to the medical device process. And there would probably be several iterations right in there for the verification test. You go to the medical device, and from there, you can validate that back to the user needs, right? So that looks like clinical trials, testing it with physicians and with patients. And then once it gets out into the market, continued risk analysis as you see how it's doing on the market, and further iterations of the medical device. So currently with our device that we have, it's pretty cool because they have this device already made, right? They did most of the engineering. These are brilliant engineers that have done a really good job designing the device. So we just want to make sure that what we have, that we're documenting it all, which has been a big hurdle for us, is making sure, like, we're going to have to go backwards, right? Because they've already figured out the user needs. They've already made the device. So we have to go backwards and write that all down in a format that will make sense to the government and meet the standards of the FDA. So we've gone through the standards. You can see here on the left, we've made some Excel sheets going through each clause in the standards and checking for compliance in this device, right? And then we're also documenting that in the bottom left corner. You can see our specifications document. And specifications is more or less your design input phase. So that's where you're putting parameters on everything, right? So we're putting in diagrams. We're saying, what temperature do we need to heat a newborn baby to? What size is does the display need to be in order for the clinician to read it? Those kind of things. And then on the right is a very important part of this documentation. That's called an FMEA table. And what we're doing there is going through each part of the device and identifying where it might fail, right? So we're doing risk analysis. And then once you identify where it might fail, you can put in something in place. If it exceeds your risk allowance, you can put something in place to reduce the risk. So like, say you're worried about wires being frayed, for example, in your power supply, you could go back and make sure those wires are properly insulated, add another insulating layer, right? And that would decrease your failure probability and the risk would be manageable. So that's a really key thing. And currently we've kind of gotten to a point where we've been working with the team in Nepal, we've been building out these documents, but we need to find someone that's really a specialist in this area to come in and guide us through our next steps. So we're looping in Spencer Walker, who's part of the Clinical Innovation Center. And I know he's a regulatory specialist, so hopefully he'll be able to help us with our next steps to just get this all done as efficiently as possible and in a way that will create a sustainable process and a sustainable pathway for future firms and future medical devices coming out of low and middle income countries. So that kind of leads me to our future directions and goals. We want to get regulatory clearance from the Nepali government. That's our number one priority because they're already having so many orders, so much demand that without that regulatory approval, this is only an experimental device. It can only go so far. So once we get that regulatory clearance, then they're really free to build an effective business out of this device and hopefully many future devices coming out of the National Innovation Center in Nepal. And then it's also one key step part of this is quantifying the impact of the Nyano Nani device through a stepped wedge randomized control trial. And that will go with the original study in which we were prioritizing the way that clinicians thought about thermal care. And hopefully we'll be able to build out a really strong, some really strong papers that show the impact of this device as well as the need for the device in Nepal. Here are my references. Thank you. I'd love to answer any questions. Hopefully I can do Dr. Tomlin and Dr. Judkin's brainchild justice.
Well, fantastic. It's always good to hear about a project, not from like just, what are the clinical challenges, but really what are potential solutions, because it's really hard to go from identification of a problem to then actually come up with an idea that can be really developed into a testable prototype. In this case, how can you talk a little bit about how you do risk analysis with each step? Like, for example, with an infant warmer, like one of the main concerns will be that it heats the child too quickly or to too high of a temperature. And especially when, you're not talking about the same weight of child, right? Like each baby weighs a little bit different than the next. And some may be big and some may be small. And so calibrating that temperature change may be quite tricky. So how would you assess risk for that specific key feature, perhaps the most important feature? And then how do you mitigate that risk? Is there a specific, I assume there's a specific process for us analyzing risk for that feature or any feature?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great example. So when we're looking at that bottom right Excel sheet where you have the diagonal things on top, say you were looking at, so here we have, right, a temperature sensor. That's our part of the device that we want to focus on. A failure mode, like you say, is maybe the temperature sensor isn't working. And so then the device is receiving inconsistent feedback and it's going to overheat the infant or underheat the infant, right? We don't know, but either way, that could be really bad. And so failure detection, right? So essentially you're going to go through each one of these things on the top until you get to a risk number that you feel is acceptable. And so the FDA has essentially the risk number set out for you. And the risk number is your failure probability times your severity level. So you could see, right, like in that column where we have the temperature sensor, if you're overheating the infant, right, the severity level would be a 7 and the failure probability would be a 2. And these are things, so this is kind of as you can see, it's not very filled out. This is something we're hoping Spencer Walker can really help us make sure that our numbers on this are correct. When I did this in the past, just in class projects and also, in various industry projects, we've more or less just, you just have to have a reason to assign your severity number and your failure probability number the way that you did, right? You just have to be able to back them up. But it is somewhat, I don't want to say arbitrary, but it's a decision you're making, right? You're deciding what's the severity level and what's the failure probability. So if you said, okay, the severity of overheating the infant and the probability of this temperature sensor malfunctioning is too high when you multiply them together for me to be comfortable with, then you need to look at, well, why would my temperature sensor fail? You know, maybe we need to source it from a more reliable manufacturer. Maybe we need to rebuild our circuit to make sure that it's integrated in process properly, that kind of thing. And then you can adjust those numbers. So each time you do that iterative process, you would include your past process in the documentation, and then you would reassign the numbers in another column to show that you actually adjusted your risk.
But some of that risk, like the severity, how would you determine that? I mean, honestly, some of this may be more of an issue. Like clinicians may look at it and say, actually, I think it would be a 10 for overheating and that, like, 4 for underheating. And so I feel like this is where having that maybe stakeholder input or user input would be invaluable, but you might get a heterogeneous amount of data. There might not necessarily be consensus. If you ask enough, you ask, 20 neonatologists, will they all come up with the same number or within some range? And do you actually use things like probabilistic sensitivity analysis to kind of take into account, like, what is the risk range? Because it's not a single number, right? It probably
Sure.
The probability will end up being a range.
Sure. Yeah. And what we have here is just a really simplistic
Gotcha.
representation. But yeah, you're right. So you would do some statistical analysis and probability into your risk priority number. And how you determine that severity level, yeah, like you said, it would be very important. Like for me, for example, I don't really understand the severity of overheating an infant.
Right.
But yeah, like you said, a neonatologist would. So what they're looking for when you turn this risk analysis documentation in is that you've done enough research to back up what you're saying, that you have a good reason, right? And you are ultimately the one deciding, and they're going to accept your decision as long as you show that you have done that analysis and you have done the research. And then I think a lot of that will come down to, looking back at, like in our example, if we have an infant warmer, right, you can look back at examples of the documentation for infant warmers in the United States and kind of see the way that they did their risk analysis. And it might be similar, because while overheating an infant or underheating an infant in Nepal may be more severe in Nepal because of a lack of resources, the outcomes or symptomatic things, you could draw some similarities there. But yeah, that's a great question. And that is the key thing for getting regulatory approval. So I appreciate that question, is that risk analysis, right? Because their main job is to keep patients safe when they're using medical devices.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, fascinating work. Questions, thoughts, comments from, yes.
Yeah, I got a question. So do the Nepalese people or patients have other alternative, like low-tech alternative, other than what you guys are trying to build? Is there already something on the market that is, I would say, lower tech than what you're trying to build?
That's a great question. There is not another radiant heat source infant warmer that's lower tech compared to what we were trying to build, but there are other ways to provide thermal care. Like for example, you can see here that covering the baby and mother together, kangaroo mother care, is a very important staple of infant warming. Making sure that.
No, but I was talking in terms of equipment, not traditional.
Okay, so specifically, you're talking specifically about a radiant heat warmer. Is there a lower technology?
Or any kind of technology, like electrical or gas, propane. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. we've looked into other similar devices to this and haven't seen lower tech alternatives that provide nearly the same benefit. However, we may not have done an exhaustive search into technologies that, like, for example, an electric blanket, like you say, or a propane heating technology. And I do think that one area for improvement, which I'm glad that you brought this up in terms of other technologies, is looking at technologies that could be implemented in a home center or a community setting, right? Because this would be specifically hospital use, right? So that would need to be a lower technology device to be implemented in a location like that.
Because to me, to follow the to the regulations take a lot of work and in the meantime, something's not happening. So I would people plug on this. And then build that, and if they even better their system for the system, then go something actually up to the standards of this is
We can't hear you well. You're breaking up.
Yeah, sorry about that. I couldn't hear your question clearly. Maybe you could send it in the chat.
Well,
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Oh,
can hear
okay.
you now.
Sorry
Oh,
about that.
yeah, much better. Yeah.
I was saying, if I have to make a decision about this, I would come up with something really low tech, doesn't need to go to the highest standard of the FDA, so that you save baby right now, and once you have something really efficient, low tech, cheap, accessible, then if the Nepalese people wants to have something more sophisticated, then you can work on that. But it sounds like they need urgent solutions to the tragic situation they have over there.
I think they've actually built this piece of equipment, so I think that this is their equipment, that this is their answer to that.
Yeah.
So I think Grace is not involved in actually building this, it's just helping them figure out how to get it through
We're talking
the
about the
process.
NIC people.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I was gonna say that could be something to bring up, and I think the hope is that hopefully once we get this regulatory process approved, right, there can be many further medical devices that hopefully can maybe be lower tech to be implemented in different settings, or other solutions that people may come up for this problem. I do know that in many hospitals in Nepal, there's a high demand for a technology like this. So this is something that's wanted at least in those settings, and hopefully can help there. But yeah, a lower technology solution in other settings could be super useful.
Leif, is there a question in the room?
Yes.
We are surgeons from the Mongolia. How is this? We don't know the situation how is in Mongolia, but in every country and every city is in give birth hospital is making skin to skin touch technique for the give birth, and also has the thermal nano machine or hell. How is the percentage in Nepal? The skin touch technique and nano device.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how is the question kind of how they would work together, or how much kangaroo mother care is used in Nepal?
I think the latter.
Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So kangaroo mother care is not always prioritized, as you can see from this research about how important these different thermal infant care recommendations are to Nepali clinicians. There's only one setting in which that would make it on the top 5 for them in terms of importance, because you can see that the bottom one, kangaroo mother care, in that bottom right corner, I think that's what you're referring to, where both the mother and the baby would be wrapped together in a blanket, right? And you get that skin to skin contact, which we know and has lots of support and lots of research that's super important. So I think, and there's we're lacking a little bit of information about how widely kangaroo mother care is used, but I know that there are studies that have shown an effective implementation, but I don't think that it's widely used in Nepal, and could definitely be an area of improvement. I do know as well that there are many cases where, the kangaroo mother care is instituted, but it cannot be continuous, right? Throughout the full 28 days, the mother is called away to different duties, or can't be there with the baby physically together for that whole time, which is where an infant warmer could come in handy as well.
Maybe this is the main risk of the hypothermia of the birth neonatals. We think in Mongolia, just after the 2 or 3 minutes later, we can make the skin to skin touch technique.
Like how soon after the birth?
So as soon as after the cutting umbilicus.
Yeah. And that's another focus of this study as well, is that there is a real need for a national guideline of these recommendations in Nepal, and there's the standard protocol for care is all over the place depending on the location in the center and the physician. And so something where you're saying, okay, we want to implement this 5 minutes after, or 2 minutes, like you said, after birth, right? Like as soon as possible, is something that's really needed in Nepal.
I have some questions too, maybe more logistical. So
yeah,
I would assume there's already a device that's similar, like a radiant heat source device for an infant or a neonate. What would the price point of that already pre-done one look like versus yours? And who's funding this, or how are you going to distribute these devices? And are you making one that's more affordable, and that was the main goal, is to create a cheaper alternative? Or is it that you don't have any access already to current made devices and you're fitting the recommendation or the standards that they wanted? And I guess kind of how does that fit in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I am going to be honest, I don't think I have a complete answer for you specifically about the price specifics. I do know that a main selling point for the Nyano Nani device is that it is more affordable than other options. I think the primary reason for that is because other options are outsourced, right? They would have to be imported to Nepal from other places. So the fact that it's able to be locally produced provides a lot of value in terms of affordability. I think it's pretty similar in capabilities, materials, function as other infant warmers that are outsourced to Nepal currently. But as I mentioned, like some problems with that is that then it's not necessarily integrated into their standard care protocols. If something breaks, right, it's hard to fix it because the parts are so far away. So that also provides value to them. But yeah, I would say that it's for sure more affordable. I would have to get back to you on specifics about price.
Okay, and then I guess second to that, so if you have created one that's more affordable, what's your next goal, I guess, after Nepal? Is Nepal the final goal and you leave the device with them? Or are you hoping to try to implement this to other similar countries in situations where you could offer a more affordable option?
Yeah, that's a great question. The people at the National Innovation Center, right? So this is, as Suna mentioned, this is their device. Like we are simply helping them push this through and helping quantify the impact so that we can make sure it has the impact really that it deserves. So that would be something they would need to spearhead in order to move to international market, but we would definitely be there to support that effort. And I know that they are interested in looking at places like India to move this device to, but that would require, and so if you get Nepali regulatory approval, we're hoping to do that regulatory approval process such that we have all the documentation to make it easy to get international approval, but it would require another step of regulatory medical device approval.
Great, thank
So
you.
that's definitely, I think that's on the horizon, but not their main priority right now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And for
thank you.
comparison's sake, the cost of a similar device in the US is a couple of $1,000s. So even if this is, $500, it's still dramatically less than importing a US or European made device. I don't know if there's a similar low cost device in India that would be a potential competitor, because there may be, but that would probably be the closest sort of other alternative option, I would think.
Yeah.
And that would be the thing to kind of to look at, right? So to follow up on the questions of production, does the National Innovation Center have any or what are their plans? Do you know? You may not know of how they're going to scale up production locally, or is that something that they've they may not disclose that to you?
Yeah, I know that right now. I wish I should have included a picture of it. So we actually, right, Dr. Tomlin and Dr. Judkins have been to Nepal and visited their firm there, and I will be going in April, which I'm very excited about. But it's currently, right, it's a really small firm, right? They just kind of have their parts all laid out. It's pretty rudimentary. And so they're definitely looking, I know that they've been hiring on new people and looking into acquiring new real estate so that they can expand. So that's something they've been looking into, because primarily this is actually their first device that they've been able to effectively see and a demand for, even though they don't necessarily do only medical devices. This is the first medical device to seek approval, but it's also the first successful device to come from the National Innovation Center as an engineering firm in general. So as they're seeing that increase in sales of this device, they're looking to expand. I know that they hired a new guy to work specifically with us on regulatory approval. I'm not sure how much they're looking on to scale up their team, but I know they are looking for some new office space as well, because they're going to want to increase production, but they don't have necessarily like a manufacturing specific location. I think it's all just the same place.
That was my question, is sort of, are they contracting with a local manufacturer? Because you have to you have to have certain, not just production output, but certain quality checks and all of those processes for QA for high volume production. So that may not be they may not have a source of expertise to do that. There's a similar, so there's a group from Duke, Dr. Tamara Fitzgerald, who's a pediatric surgeon and biomedical engineer, who's been working with colleagues in Uganda on a variety of different pediatric neonatal type devices, and they have developed some new, I wouldn't say new, some low-cost devices to treat various pediatric surgical conditions like gastroschisis, which is where the abdominal wall doesn't form and the intestines are outside of the abdominal wall, and they can dry up and they can really just disintegrate. They can necrose, and then the baby won't survive because it can't eat because it doesn't have any intestines. And so obviously a major problem, but they've developed low-cost, locally made products, and one of their challenges is how do you actually produce it, because the university partnerships have created new tech, but that doesn't mean, even if you can create a regulatory process for the country, which by the way, most countries in the world don't have established regulatory processes. There's a lot of good literature looking at creation of those in sub-Saharan Africa. But even if, because everybody relies on FDA or like getting the CE mark, and none of that necessarily applies, as Mo said, it doesn't necessarily apply to low and middle income countries. So even if you can get through the regulatory process, then you have to kind of think about how do you manufacture it, and whether there's commercialization potential, there's enough volume, there's enough margin, all of those things that have to be worked out, which is the next major major
Yeah.
mountain that needs to be climbed to address sort of significant local need. So there's some real challenges. It's not just identify a problem and develop a low-cost solution. Even if you do, just
Sure.
actually getting it to practice is so difficult because there's just not infrastructure to support it. You know, a lot of countries don't have manufacturing capacity. You know, that's why things are important.
Right.
So,
Yeah, no, those are some great points. I'd be interested to, if you could send me any resources you have from that group that you were talking about. I would be interested to see that too. Definitely a big hurdle. So we will see.
Yeah. If you look up Tamara Fitzgerald on PubMed from Duke, you'll get a bunch of different papers. She just spoke. We just had her speak here at the Department of Surgery in November. Actually, I don't know if there's it must be recorded. I can see if I can find a recording of her talk, because she gave a similar talk focusing on the different devices that they've worked on. And they've actually created a tech lab that is at Duke and in Uganda, where the maker space looks almost identical with the same equipment, so that if there's a team in one place that's working on a new device, the team on the other in the other place can replicate it. And it's just the same, it's the same equipment and same limited equipment. And so the team at Duke can't access it, you know, I don't know, whatever.
Sure, same constraints.
Laser printing devices, you know, whatever.
Right, but they're like, okay.
So it's interesting because they've tried to kind of set that up so that they can brainstorm together and innovate together. So
way cool. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah. Other questions, thoughts, comments? Good project.
Okay. Hi, I'm new to the group. I'm Candace Morrissey. Grace, thanks so much for your really wonderful presentation and its exciting work. Clearly, there's a lot of reasons that something like this can be beneficial for Nepal. You're helping them in their own desire to sort of solve their own problems and create a robust and valid regulatory process so that they're making a safe product essentially for their population. You had mentioned that part of what your group wants to do is to measure impact. Can you just say a little bit more about how you intend to do that?
Yes, I know. Thank you. That's a great question. So Dr. Tomlin, I think the eventual goal is to have the stepped wedge randomized control trial, which I would assume that the majority of you know a lot more than me about the specifics of that. But from what I understand, that means that it's implemented, the innovation or the intervention is implemented at various times, right? It's not all at once, given the stepped wedge part of the randomized control trial. And that's what's happening right now with this infant warmer, because it's already implemented in some centers. And so there are measures, like, for example, the temperature of neonatal bursts, 5 minutes after, 30 minutes after, an hour after, each day for 28 days, right? How many of them are dying? Measures like that we're hoping to see a change with at centers where the infant warmer is being used. And the goal, I think, is to quantify that change, hopefully being able to isolate the infant warmer as the variable and show its effectiveness through a study like that. And I think it will be, more than 10 centers in Nepal. So hopefully some good statistical power with that as well. But that's the idea. I think Dr. Tomlin could speak a little bit better to the exact plans. But hopefully that answered your question.
I think that sounds great. Dr. Morrissey will be talking about some of her work at some point in the next few weeks or months. Dr. Morrissey is an anesthesiologist, and
Okay.
The reason I mention that is, these neonates often, when they're born under distress, like there is a lot of involvement of surgeons, anesthesiologists, and neonatal intensive care physicians in using these kinds of devices and thinking about what the outcomes are of providing this kind of care and providing comprehensive care, doing all the things, not just reaching for the most fancy, even if it's low cost and locally produced kind of option. So yeah, Candace, I don't remember which field of anesthesia you're in, but you probably can comment more on this than anybody else.
I'm a cardiac anesthesiologist.
Oh, that's right.
A lot of time, and quite a bit of time in Mongolia with our cardiac anesthesia group, and I'm a perioperative photographer, and I spend a lot of time with women with complex cardiac disease who are pregnant, and so some of my work is centered around that. But mostly, I'm just here to learn from this group. I've done a lot of kind of work around, and some in Nepal, and that. But I'm right now working on a policy and economics degree at the London School of Economics, and so taking a bird's eye view of global medicine with that work. So anyway, I agree with it's very hard to feel good about an isolated high-tech solution when some of the as you were mentioning, just no nonsense, simple solutions that we know work can also be put in place that are, as Mo, I don't know you, but was mentioning, a lot of times it's just helping to create an understood standard about the effectiveness of some of these lower tech solutions as well. But I applaud this effort because, it is, you sort of have to attack it from all sides, and for them to be guided to doing this in a way that is safe, creating a safe system and a safe product is wonderful.
Yeah. No, and I can really appreciate that as well, that a national standard for thermal care would go really a long ways.
And how do you promulgate that? And how do you evaluate that? There's a lot to be said about QI and various settings, and every setting actually. And so it's not just like, can you create national guidelines? Are they being followed? And who's monitoring that? And what are the repercussions? And who's in charge and what authority do they have? And how do you enforce that? How do you educate people? Do you incorporate it into nursing training or physician training or whatever else? So it becomes quite a big challenge. And sometimes those bigger things are more intimidating than creating a single device that can be a solution.
Can do something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we as humans like to do things. And so I think there's a big component of that too, because those other challenges are significant, right? And yet they're cheaper, easier, and you could probably start having impact tomorrow. Like Dr. Spy said, do all those things and you can probably start saving lives tomorrow. Why wait to create something and then put it through a regulatory process? And so there's definitely ethical issues there. And then the other part is too, that there are a lot of people who say, why don't you learn how to walk before you try to run? And there is probably some value judgment that comes with that. Who are we to say somebody should run before they can, or walk before they can run? It's not our place to tell anybody what to do. And so and again, that's the beauty of this project, which is something that they've already worked on. It's not something that you're taking there. It's not something that University of Utah is trying to make there. This is something that they're working on. And if it is their priority, then they're leading it. They're asking for specific help, then that's something we can feel good about giving without necessarily making a value judgment one way or the other.
Yeah, for sure. I think a big part of it too, in my mind, the way I see it, and I believe the way that the National Innovation Center sees it as well, is the empowerment of an engineer in a low and middle income country, kind of like you were alluding to, so that should they have an idea, and I think the reality is that there are infant warmers already in hospitals in Nepal, right? They're just outsourced, they're few and far between, they're broken, they're not integrated into their care properly, right? So hopefully having one there can make a change in that. But yeah, hope if they have further solutions in the future, that it will be easier for them to implement those on their own accord. Yeah, I love that idea. But I agree that there are other things that we definitely can hopefully look at in the future or now to improve the situation as well.
Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Well, we could probably go on for a while, so thanks, Grace, for working on this and sharing it with us. If nobody else has any comments, we can wrap up and then meet again next week. I don't know who's speaking next week. I don't even know if we have anybody set to speak next week. I have to figure that out, and Anna's out of the country, so I'm flying blind. So.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, nice work.
Thank you, Grace.
Okay. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Okay.